What happened when an undercover CEO heard a forgotten melody that didn't belong to the man who claimed it? You're about to find out. Welcome, wonderful listeners. You have impeccable taste for stories with heart, mystery, and justice. Today's tale isn't just about music. It's about a legacy stolen, a quiet sister's strength, and the power of truth to heal what was broken. If you believe that every unsung voice deserves to be heard, this story will stay with you long after the final note. So sit back, relax, and let us take you inside the melody that was stolen. The conservatory was still cloaked in shadow when Alexander Vance arrived, his breath visible in the early Chicago chill. It was just after 5:00 a.m., and the ornate front doors of Aria Conservatory were locked, as expected. But the side loading entrance, near the practice halls, had a faint glow behind its frosted glass. Through the narrow window, he saw a woman seated alone in one of the lesser-used rehearsal rooms, fingers gliding across the keys of a worn upright piano. She didn't seem to notice him, or anything else, really. Her movements were fluid, focused, reverent. The melody drifting from the room was slow and aching, filled with minor rises and sudden rests. And then it hit him. He knew that music. Not from a student recital or competition submission. No, it was a theme from the Braxton Symphony, Aria Conservatory's crown jewel and most commercially successful piece in 2 decades. Alexander froze. The phrasing was too precise to be coincidence, too heartfelt to be mimicry. It was the original form of that melody, raw, slightly unpolished, but unmistakably the same soul. As he stood in the hallway, invisible to the woman inside, a strange sensation ran through him. Guilt? Recognition? He didn't know yet. All he knew was that he was supposed to start his undercover stint today posing as a low-level administrative trainee named Ray. But in this quiet, sacred moment, it was clear something far more important was unfolding. This wasn't just a staffing audit or a morale check. This was the sound of someone playing their truth into an empty room, and somehow it had been stolen, polished, and broadcast to the world under someone else's name. He watched the woman, petite, hunched slightly, with a soft gray cardigan and her hair loosely clipped, stand and stretch as the final note lingered in the air. She picked up a small folder, tucked it under her arm, and turned out the light. Alexander stepped back into the shadows, heart pounding. He didn't know who she was yet, but he knew one thing with certainty. She was the key to a story buried beneath fame, fraud, and forgotten names. And it had just begun to play. Later that morning, Alexander stepped into his new role as Ray, a temp administrative assistant, shadowing the registrar's office. Dressed in plain slacks and a faded sweater, he blended easily with the bustle of the conservatory's support staff, paperwork runners, schedule managers, and music librarians. No one paid him much attention, which was exactly what he needed. As he moved through his orientation tasks, he kept an eye out for the woman from the piano room. It didn't take long. Mid-morning, she emerged from a side corridor with a cart of archived scores, her eyes downcast, her movements precise. "That's Sophie," one of the staff whispered casually. "She tunes the pianos and does transcription work for faculty. Quiet type. Been here forever." Alexander nodded, but said nothing. Something about her still gnawed at him. Not just the music, but the way she seemed to exist in a different rhythm than the rest of the staff, like she was out of step with the conservatory's glossy tempo. During lunch, while the office cleared out, Alexander slipped into the faculty archives. Officially, he was looking for missing inventory reports, but in truth, he was chasing the tune from that morning. He found the published score for the Braxton Symphony and scanned the opening bars. Yes, there it was. The phrasing, the structure, the minor modulation that tugged at the heart just before the refrain. But what chilled him wasn't the similarity. It was that what Sophie had played was older, less ornate, more intimate. A composer's private voice, not yet filtered for public consumption. That realization sent him diving deeper. He searched through digital and physical submission logs from a decade ago and found something startling. an application from a Julian Tran dated 9 years earlier that had been rejected. Attached to it was a file labeled Midwestern Requiem, First Movement. The title was different, but when he opened the score, the truth snapped into place. It was the same piece, the same DNA. Alexander sat back, heart thudding. Sophie hadn't been playing a cover or a copy. She had been playing her brother's music, a masterpiece buried, stolen, and rebranded under another man's name. Whatever this assignment had started as, it was no longer about numbers or morale. It was about justice, musical, moral, and deeply personal. Over the next 2 days, Alexander continued his quiet investigation between filing schedules, updating attendance logs, and fetching coffee for faculty who barely glanced at him. But each evening, once the halls emptied and the echoes of rehearsals faded, he returned to the archives, digging deeper into the life and disappearance of Julian Tran. The name had once appeared briefly in Aurea's records, a gifted scholarship student, composer, and pianist. But after 2014, he vanished. No graduation, no alumni notes, no mention in press releases. Alexander traced an old student ID to a withdrawal notice filed just weeks after a rejected composition submission. There was no cause listed, just a one-line note, personal circumstances. But when he accessed external databases, the truth began to unfold. A death certificate confirmed it. Julian Tran had died in a car accident less than 2 months after his submission was declined. The date matched almost exactly with the release of the preliminary press materials announcing Miles Braxton's new masterpiece, later known as the Braxton Symphony. The theft had been clean, brutal, buried under time, silence, and corporate paperwork. In a box labeled Historical Proposals Unapproved, Alexander found the final piece, Julian's original handwritten notes. There were coffee stains, rough sketches, alternate endings, signs of an artist mid-struggle, pouring everything into his work, and in the margin of one page, a short scribbled phrase, "For Sophie, for what we dreamed." Alexander read it again, and the magnitude of what had been taken settled over him like a weight, not just a composition, but a legacy. A family's dream. A brother's final offering. He could suddenly picture it. Julian gone, the dream shattered, and Sophie left to carry the grief in silence, burying her talent in tuning forks and manuscript paper while the world applauded a lie. It wasn't just unethical. It was theft of the purest, cruelest kind. Alexander leaned back in the chair, staring at the folder in his lap. Somewhere in this building, Sophie Tran still came in every day, still walked these halls, still tuned the pianos used to perform the music that had destroyed her family's life. And no one knew. Or worse, they had forgotten. But he hadn't. Not anymore. The ghosts were no longer just in the file drawer. They were everywhere, and it was time to listen to them. On a damp Thursday evening, Alexander lingered past his shift, pretending to tidy up spreadsheets in the admin office. Through the smudged glass, he watched Sophie wheel a cart of sheet music toward the rear exit, her usual end-of-day ritual. When she slipped out into the alleyway behind the conservatory, he followed. At a careful distance, she walked with purpose, her small frame hunched against the cold wind, never once checking over her shoulder. A few blocks away, she chained her bicycle beside a laundromat, then ducked into a narrow, aging apartment complex. Alexander waited, unsure of what he was hoping to see, until her light came on in a third-floor window. The space inside looked sparse, a single desk, a stack of scores, and a piano keyboard lit by a crooked desk lamp. No signs of indulgence or comfort, just disciplined survival. The next morning, during a routine update to HR records, Alexander discreetly accessed her payment file. A portion of Sophie's check, almost half, was funneled every month to an entity labeled Greenridge Creative Lending, a known high-interest arts funding agency. Alarmed, he did a quick lookup. The loan account was nearly a decade old and showed no signs of principal reduction. It was one of those cruel financial traps designed to exploit desperate talent, artists clinging to dreams while being bled dry. That night, unable to sleep, Alexander dug into court records and uncovered the full picture. Julian and Sophie had co-signed the loan back when they still believed their music could change their future. When Julian died, the debt fell solely to her, and she'd been paying it ever since, quietly, relentlessly, never missing a single month. Even when it meant working overtime jobs, no one noticed. Suddenly, every image of her made sense: the calloused hands, the sunken eyes, the refusal to accept promotions or praise. She wasn't shy, she was burdened, crushed under the weight of a dream turned nightmare. And still she came in early, tuned the pianos used to perform her brother's stolen masterpiece, and returned home to a silent room filled with unpaid memories. Alexander felt the burn of shame in his chest. This wasn't just a story of corporate theft anymore. It was a tragedy left to rot in the corners of Aria's legacy. And he knew he couldn't walk away from it. The following Saturday, Alexander made the quiet drive to Oak Glen, the quiet suburb where former creative director Miles Braxton now lived in self-imposed obscurity. The once charismatic public face of Aria's artistic innovation had vanished from the music scene 5 years ago, following a quiet resignation amid swirling rumors of misconduct. Alexander had managed to secure a brief meeting under the pretense of writing a retrospective article for Aria. Braxton's home was modest but tasteful, with dust-covered awards lining the shelves and faded press clippings curled in neglected frames. The man who opened the door was grayer, slower, and visibly cautious. "I don't do interviews anymore," he said flatly. But when Alexander mentioned Julian Tran's name, a flicker of recognition crossed Braxton's face, and for a moment he looked like a man caught in his own reflection. Inside, over coffee neither of them touched, Alexander pressed gently. "Julian submitted something once, didn't he? Something you saw before the board ever did." Braxton sat back, lips tightening, silence growing heavy. Then, with a brittle laugh, he admitted, "Julian's music was different, raw, honest, the kind that doesn't come from ambition, but from soul." He leaned forward, voice quieter now. "I didn't steal it. Not at first. I just used it to inspire my own work. Then the deadline hit. No one had seen his version but me. I tweaked the transitions, gave it a new title. No one asked questions. Everyone was too busy praising me." His eyes drifted to the corner of the room where an old vinyl record, the Braxton Symphony, sat in a glass case. "Do you know what it's like," he added, "to be applauded for something you didn't create? It eats you alive." Alexander didn't respond. He didn't need to. The guilt in Braxton's voice was confession enough. But what struck Alexander most wasn't the admission, it was the apathy. Braxton had never made amends, never tried to right the wrong. He had simply faded into a quiet life of avoidance, leaving the fallout to consume Sophie. As Alexander stood to leave, Braxton offered one final line. "That music was never mine, not really. But it's too late to fix that, isn't it?" Alexander paused at the door, turned, and said with calm resolve, "Not for me, and not for her." Then he walked away, knowing exactly what needed to happen next. On Monday morning, the air in the conservatory felt heavier, as if carrying the weight of what Alexander was about to do. He found Sophie in the workshop, hunched over a set of warped piano hammers, hands methodically sanding, eyes distant. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. She glanced up, surprised. Ray never initiated conversation. He hesitated, then dropped the charade. "My name isn't Ray," he said gently. "I'm Alexander Vance, CEO of Aria." The silence that followed was thick and stunned. But her face didn't show fear, only confusion. "Why are you here?" she asked, rising slowly. "Because I heard something that didn't belong to the man who claimed it," he said, "and I've spent the last week finding out who it did belong to." He reached into his coat and unfolded a worn composition, the original handwritten version of Julian's Midwestern Requiem. Her breath caught. Alexander laid out the full truth. The rejection letter, the timeline, Braxton's confession, how her brother's composition had been stolen, reshaped, and paraded to the world as a masterpiece under someone else's name, how she had unknowingly worked for a system that profited from her family's loss. Sophie didn't speak at first. Her expression was unreadable. Jaw clenched, hands gripping the edge of the table. United to exhaustion, she whispered, to keep afloat the institution that buried him. Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. She stood straighter, steadier. Why are you telling me this? Why not just fix it quietly and pretend I never knew? Alexander looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. Because you deserve more than silence. You deserve a choice. And truth. Sophie sat down, the reality settling over her like cold rain. Her shoulders trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer effort of containing the heartbreak. He died thinking his music was worthless, she said softly. Thinking he failed. Alexander shook his head. He didn't fail. We did. But that ends now. For the first time, her guarded expression cracked, just slightly. She looked at the manuscript in her hands as if seeing her brother again through the notes and measures. She didn't need an apology. She needed purpose. And as she ran her fingers gently over the ink, her voice steadied. Then let's make it right. Not with headlines or pity, but with the truth where it matters. The following day, Alexander called an emergency meeting with Aria Conservatory's board of directors. Held in the elegant but austere boardroom atop the administrative wing, the meeting drew curious glances and hushed murmurs. This kind of urgency was rare. Seated around the polished table were the usual faces: cautious financiers, aging trustees, and art patrons with more legacy than vision. Alexander stood at the head, composed but resolute, as a projector hummed to life behind him. I'm here today to reveal something that has been buried for nearly a decade, he began, and to ask this board not for approval, but for accountability. The first slide appeared, Julian Tran's original manuscript, time-stamped and signed. Then came the comparison, side-by-side scores, Braxton's published Symphony and Julian's rejected submission. Gasps rippled through the room. Some members exchanged uncomfortable looks. Others leaned forward in disbelief. Alexander continued. The music that launched our most successful modern composition, the Braxton Symphony, was not his work. It was stolen from a student, a young man who died before he ever saw the world hear his music. His sister, Sophie Tran, has been working here ever since, quietly, tirelessly, in the very halls where her brother's voice was erased. A heavy silence fell. Diane Mercer, the board chairwoman, cleared her throat. These are serious accusations, Alexander. Do you have a signed confession? He replied evenly. I have a recorded admission, time-stamped documents, internal email logs, and Braxton's own words. But this isn't about proof. It's about principle. Another member, visibly uncomfortable, asked, What are you proposing? Alexander laid it out. Full credit for Julian Tran as the composer of the symphony, immediate settlement of Sophie's remaining loan debt, a fellowship program for underrepresented composers, and a rebranding of the suite as the Tran Symphony. Predictably, some resisted. It's been years, one board member argued. Do we really need to reopen the past? That was when Sophie, quietly seated at the side, stood. You didn't bury the past, she said. You built a concert hall on top of it. Her voice didn't waver. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking you to stop applauding a thief while the rightful creator rests in an unmarked legacy. The room stilled. It was no longer just data or scandal. It was a reckoning. And the board knew they had only one decision left to make. The boardroom, once bristling with formality and guarded responses, now sat in contemplative silence. Sophie's words had shifted the atmosphere, not just pierced it. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Diane Mercer finally spoke, her tone softer. Miss Tran, we will take a short recess to deliberate. As the board filed out, Alexander remained seated beside Sophie, watching her silently trace the edge of her brother's manuscript with her fingertips. 30 minutes later, the board returned, faces solemn, eyes less defensive. Diane stood. After reviewing the evidence and considering the moral weight of this situation, we have come to a consensus. The decision was clear and resolute. Effective immediately, Julian Tran would be credited as the sole composer of the symphony formerly known as the Braxton Symphony. His name would appear in all future publications, recordings, and promotional materials. A public statement would be released, acknowledging the past mistake and explaining the correction. Sophie's debt to Greenridge Creative Lending would be settled in full by Aria Conservatory, with interest, but it didn't stop there. The board also approved Alexander's proposal to launch the Tran Fellowship for Emerging Composers, a mentorship and funding program aimed at giving unknown musical talents a platform, just as Julian had once sought. Additionally, Sophie was offered the position of Director of Legacy Arts, a newly created role that would give her creative control over archival preservation, ethical review of composer submissions, and guidance for young artists entering the professional world. There was one final matter, the renaming of the symphony itself. With your consent, Diane said, turning to Sophie, we'd like to call it the Tran Symphony, in honor of Julian. And you. Sophie's eyes welled, but she remained composed. Only if his full name is used, she replied softly. Julian du Tran. And no embellishments. Let his music speak for itself. As the meeting adjourned, several board members approached her with genuine, if awkward, apologies. But Sophie didn't linger. She gathered the manuscript, nodded to Alexander, and walked quietly from the room. The correction had been made, not just in the record books, but in the heart of the institution that had once erased her family's voice. Justice had finally been given a name. 6 months later, the grand reopening of Aria Conservatory's East Wing drew a crowd unlike any in recent memory. Cameras flashed, alumni returned, and faculty lined the aisles of the newly renovated Tran Hall, its name etched in brass above the entry. Inside, the space had been transformed into more than just a performance venue. It was a monument to integrity. Framed along the walls were photos of Julian du Tran, archival sheets of his original compositions, and a bronze plaque that read, "In honor of the unheard, the overlooked, and the silenced, let music tell the truth." At center stage, a young fellowship student from the inaugural Tran program took her place behind the grand piano, her hands trembling with the weight of what she was about to play. The world premiere of Julian's Midwestern Requiem, in its full, unaltered form. In the front row sat Sophie, her hands clasped in her lap, wearing a simple black dress and a quiet, unassuming expression. She hadn't wanted to give a speech. She felt her brother's music spoke louder than she ever could. But as the first aching chords filled the hall, tears welled in her eyes. The piece unfolded not as a performance, but as a resurrection. Every note brought Julian back, his bold phrasing, his emotional signatures, his silences where words had once failed. For so long she had listened to that melody under a false name. Now it soared freely. Beside her, Alexander watched the audience, how they leaned forward, stilled their breath, wiped their eyes. The conservatory was no longer merely preserving tradition. It was owning its past and opening its doors to a future shaped by humility and justice. When the final note faded, a hush lingered before applause erupted, not in explosive fanfare, but in something softer, reverent, grateful. Sophie stood briefly, gave a modest nod, then sat back down. She wasn't there for recognition. She was there because, for the first time in a decade, her brother's voice had been truly heard. And more than that, it was being passed on, not stolen, not buried, but offered as a gift to those still searching for their place in the music. The joy was quiet, but it was real, and it had finally returned. The following afternoon, long after the applause had faded and the cameras were packed away, Sophie found herself walking alone through the side streets of Chicago. The city was bustling, but her mind was quiet, a stillness she hadn't felt in years. She passed by a tiny record shop tucked between two cafes, its windows cluttered with old jazz albums and obscure classical reissues. On impulse, she stepped inside. The bell over the door jingled softly, and the scent of vinyl and aged wood filled the space. Browsing slowly, her fingers paused over a dusty copy of Satie's Gymnopédies. Without thinking, she bought it. No mission, no reason, just something beautiful to bring home. That night, in her modest apartment, she placed the record on her turntable, lowered the needle, and let the soft, meditative notes wash over her. She didn't analyze the tempo, she didn't reach for a pen to transcribe the rhythms. For once, she wasn't working. She was simply listening. A cup of tea in hand, legs curled beneath her on the couch, Sophie let herself just be. There were no thoughts of debts, no deadlines, no ghost notes echoing from the past. The burdens she had carried for so long, Julian's loss, the stolen music, the guilt of not fighting sooner, had begun to lift, replaced by something gentler. Peace. As the second track played, she reached for her notebook, not to write down chords or corrections, but a few words that came to her. The music was never lost, just waiting. Outside her window, the sun dipped low over the skyline, casting long, warm streaks of gold through the glass. For the first time in years, Sophie smiled. Not the tight, guarded smile of someone getting by, but the quiet curve of someone remembering what joy felt like. She thought of Julian, of that last composition he'd handed her, scrawled and unfinished. Maybe it was time to finish it. Not for the world, not for Aria, but for herself. She rose, walked to the piano and placed her fingers gently on the keys. The melody came softly, unsure at first, but growing. This time, it wasn't about survival. It was about rediscovery, about healing, about music, once again, being hers. The story of the melody that was stolen teaches us that truth and legacy cannot remain buried forever, especially when someone carries them with quiet courage. Sophie Tran spent years in the shadows, working tirelessly not for recognition, but to honor the memory of her brother Julian, whose musical genius was stolen and forgotten by the institution they once trusted. Her story is a reminder that justice isn't just about exposing the wrong. It's about restoring what's right. Alexander Vance, the Undercover CEO, didn't just uncover a scandal. He chose to take responsibility, using his power to give voice to the voiceless. For audiences over 50, the message resonates deeply, that it's never too late to make amends, to recognize buried talent, or to honor those who were silenced. Even after loss, healing is possible, not through grand gestures, but through small, honest acts of integrity, acknowledgement, and care. In the end, Sophie doesn't seek the spotlight. She seeks peace. And through music, justice, and quiet perseverance, she finds it.